Good morning and welcome to the Adorama Live Theater at the CBS Radio New York studios in Hudson Square. We're excited to bring you this second special presentation of Make It Count, Millennials and the New York Primary. I'm WCBS reporter and anchor Marla Diamond.
And I'm Sonia Rincon with 1010 Wins and CBS 2 News. And as we told you on Friday when we heard from supporters of the Democratic candidates, the millennial voters have a big say in who becomes the next president. There's almost an equal number of voters from the millennial generation as there is from the baby boomer generation.
But historically, voters between the age of 18 and 29 turn out in lower rates than any other voting bloc. So what or who will drive the millennials to the polls to make their vote count?
Today, we're joined by millennial GOP supporters Madeline, Johannes, and Neil.
And we're also joined by Rock the Vote's Sarah Audello. She is Rock the Vote's political and field director. Let's turn to our panel. Millennials are socially liberal, fiscally conservative, and not wholly engaged in politics. According to a 2014 Pew Research study, Republican millennials are not conservative. They believe in climate change. They're pro-gay marriage. Everything that it seems that the three GOP candidates are not. So how does the party appeal to this huge group that now outnumber baby boomers?
I just want to first off thank you for having us today. I think that in of itself kind of shows what an important election this will be. And yes, I do think that as a millennial myself, I think millennials do have more social views, more liberal views on the social aspects. I think politically they're conservative, and I think that for an election, you don't vote based on the social views. You vote based on the kind of the bigger, broader issues at hand, like national security and our economic well-being. So I think those are our main targets.
Well, so I think that right now a lot of millennials are still going into the workforce or are still in college. I think when they're in that stage, social issues tend to be their highest priority. So I think over time, eventually they'll switch to the fiscal issues when they're, 30 years old, they're married, they have kids. When you get to that point, I think when fiscal issues start to take over and start to dominate, who am I going to vote for based on economics, job creation, I think that's where the Republican Party is really going to start winning over the millennial votes. I think you just have to give it that time, really.
I agree with both of them. I mean, I think people our age are mostly liberal, but when you look at it, the social issues are really not major issues that are going to determine this election. Yet you have a candidate like Ted Cruz who will focus on gay marriage, who will mention that he's anti-gay marriage, and that will alienate young conservative voters. I think for people our age, we don't care about the social issues as much. We don't, I think for the most part, people our age are pro-gay marriage. We all have friends who are gay or lesbian, and it's not a big issue. Even abortion, we could say the law is what it is, and, Donald Trump eventually came to that conclusion. He made a big mistake, and that messed him up in Wisconsin, but you look at it, and on the face of it, it's the law. It's not going to change. Let's focus on national security. That has to be top priority. And let's focus on economics. And the two of those are major issues. But I feel the one thing I disagree with you on is that there aren't many conservative voters. And most people our age are liberal, and they agree with President Barack Obama. And most of them are siding with Bernie Sanders, to be honest with you.
Mm-hmm. We heard from lots of Bernie Sanders supporters on Friday, very passionate and very young. And they talked about social media, how social media is really speaking to them as millennials. That's where they're getting their information about the campaign. That's where they're sharing their opinions. Would you guys like to talk about social media a little bit and how you guys are sharing information and sharing your political views and encouraging each other?
Sure.
Yeah, so I think with social media, the one thing that no one really talks about is how difficult it actually is to have a good conversation on politics. I mean, honestly, I remember back in 2012 when you had the Mitt Romney, President Obama election, and Hofstra University, where I go to school, was hosting the debate. So we were at the center of that whole, political discourse. And a lot of people, I mean, what happened was I supported Mitt Romney, and then people just, name called me, a bigot, and they called me a homophobe on social media. And it's very hard, I think, to have an honest discussion. Most people, what they don't realize is a lot of Bernie Sanders, you go on social media, you criticize some of his policies, and then all of a sudden these people just resort to name calling you. So I think one thing people aren't talking about is on Twitter and on Facebook and on everything, is a lot of name calling and a lot of viciousness that happens on social media. It's easier to do that on social media than in person.
Mm-hmm. I think it is interesting, though, how social media has gauged a larger audience that might not have originally been involved in the election. So I think it's reaching more people. I think it was Fox News had said by January 1st, 53 million people were communicating and talking about the election. And I think that interaction is amazing. I think that if it weren't for social media, I don't know that as many people, especially our age, would be as engaged with what's happening. And I think, words have power, and if delivered correctly and in a positive way, they can really have a huge impact.
Right. I mean, social media is both good and bad. I mean, we could have positive interaction and talk with other people. And as a journalist myself, I'm going to tweet out. I'll always use fact-based information. Any retweets are always of reputable news sources. But you have people, especially our age, who trust anything they read on Facebook, on Twitter, and you look at any story, depending on what source you're getting it from, whether it be the cable news channels or you get it from an online source, you have to be conscious of what are their motivations. And that's something, we learn in school as journalists, but not something everyone else knows. So for people like us, we follow the campaigns, we follow the everyday, and we're watching this. I mean, if you don't watch one day, I feel like, I lost something, I missed something. But people our age are not paying attention to it as much in the mainstream media. They're following social media, and they're following Facebook and Twitter and Instagram, who, took a selfie, and Hillary Clinton can't get through the subway. Those are not the main issues we should be talking about, but that's what draws attention, and that's what gets the retweets and the likes.
Maddie, you're a Trump supporter. Are you reluctant to post your support on pages like Facebook because of what your friends might, reply back?
I think, like they both had said already, that, comments can be vicious, of course. I think, again, thoughtful messaging. I think open discussion is always something that I welcome. So if it was something that I felt passionate enough to post about and kind of knew that there could come with some maybe vicious comments or maybe really positive comments, I think if it were to start discussion that was a positive-based discussion that actually led to maybe somebody saying, oh, I didn't think about it that way, or, just giving a little bit more insight on one of these candidates, I think yes, I would definitely post.
I think the Hillary and the Bernie supporters who were here on Friday would certainly agree with you guys that it does get very mean and nasty sometimes. One of the things that Sarah mentioned is that this is such a different political campaign than it was back in October when the deadline was to choose party affiliation in New York. How has the evolution of the Republican primary campaign changed your view? Has it changed? Have you essentially had the same view all along, or has it sort of shaped and shifted? And what has spoken to you in the last few months, because the primary is tomorrow?
Well, I'm just going to start off by saying, as the Trump supporter up here, I think we can all say that he has said a few statements that make all of us, even the supporters, head spin a little bit at times. So I think with progress in following Trump and following, his behavior, how he handles certain things, I think, he's learning. I think that as far as what I find appealing about his approach is, and somewhat welcoming, is that he doesn't have that kind of sleek, slimy presence that most politicians have, where they're very suave when they get on stage and they know what to say and when to say it, and they're kind of more refined. And I think Trump speaks through emotion, and he speaks to the average person who might not necessarily is going about it in the most proactive way, but he's going it in the way that he knows best. And it's not to please anybody, it's not to make friends with anybody, it's to truly share the issues that are Americans and the Republicans are also facing, and Democrats. And so it's been, I think, that progression and watching that unfold has been interesting for me.
Johannes, were you always supportive of John Kasich, or did this sort of evolve for you?
Yeah, so I've actually have been a supporter of Kasich basically through the entire campaign. What's interesting, though, is back in October, like you mentioned, most people were starting to switch over to Marco Rubio. And I think now, after Rubio dropped out, you then had this sort of splinter where some people then went for John Kasich, some people went for Ted Cruz, and like what you were mentioning earlier was that the New York registration was back in October, and I think that can really have an impact because you had different candidates back then, and now you have different candidates now. I think that's interesting that you had so many people running, and everything has just switched in such over the recent months, I guess. But I think one thing is that over the months, I've been really pushing to get people to vote for John Kasich. I think the reason why people were hesitant to go with Rubio was because, like you said, he was too slimy. He seemed too professional or too much of a politician, really. I think with Trump and a little bit of Kasich, what they benefit is that sort of honesty, that they seem a little bit more off the cuff, like a regular person, really.
There's no question Donald Trump has been good for this race. I mean, he's brought up issues. I don't think without him bringing up the wall on day one, we would be talking about that. Yes, it brought tons of controversy, but if he didn't bring up the wall, would John Kasich be supportive of that? Would Marco Rubio be supportive of that? Ted Cruz? I don't think they would, because it's cautious territory to bring that up and alienate some illegal and legal immigrants. However, Trump and you mentioned this, Maddie, Trump and Bernie Sanders have both channeled into that anger, that voters have that emotion that they're going out to vote for Trump because they feel the political system's corrupt, it's rigged, as he said today and yesterday. As Bernie Sanders is saying, political system's rigged, and it's the money and the Wall Street has influence. But what people, and I think what people want now is they want someone, they've been hating politicians for years, and finally they have two candidates, one being a senator for many years of Vermont, and one being Donald Trump, who is, you wouldn't think, is a politician at all. He's trying to refine himself a little bit. He makes those missteps, but I think because it's Donald Trump, it's okay because he's not a seasoned politician, and it makes him human in a way. But I think both Donald Trump and Bernie Sanders have channeled that anger. And when you talk about Wall Street, well, Bernie Sanders says, well, Wall Street, is paying off these politicians. Well, Donald Trump said, I paid, to Democrats, I paid to Hillary Clinton. And, he, as a businessman, and, I actually read his book, just reading in the midst of The Art of the Deal, just to get some background and see what he did in the 80s and the 70s. He did have to pay people because as a builder and you need, if you have done construction on your home and, had to hire an architect, you have to get building approval. So people can understand that. Hillary Clinton taking money from Wall Street, and she said today on CBS 880 that, well, it had no influence on me. You can't prove that. However, it's not the speeches. It's not the $250,000 that I pay for speeches. It's $250,000 that Goldman Sachs paid for influence. They don't care about the speech she gives. It's the influence that it has behind that gives a bad connotation, and people our age say, listen, she's taking money from people. We don't trust her. And a lot of people don't trust her our age.
That's one thing that I know is resonating with Donald Trump supporters. But one issue that Donald Trump has brought to the forefront recently is the issue of delegates. Are you guys following the whole possibility of a contested convention and what that might mean for the candidates that you guys support and are following?
So I have been following the whole delegate race, and I think, it will go to a broker convention. I'm fairly positive about that, but I'm not actually that worried that the party somehow is going to splinter or suddenly collapse after the broken convention. A lot of people don't remember this, or maybe I guess the older people, but certainly not millennials because they weren't alive. Back in 1976, the Republican Party had a broker convention between Ford and Ronald Reagan. Ford won that. The Republican Party didn't collapse, and that was a closer broker convention than what likely will happen here, where Donald Trump will probably be very close to the 1237, but won't quite get there. So to be honest, I'm still confident that the party will still be there. I don't think that the system's rigged. I think that's just Trump complaining that he's losing, really, and he's just trying to flip so that the media can focus on this whole other thing about how weird state parties are like picking their delegates. I think, this has been the system for quite some time now. No one was foreseeing 30 years ago that Donald Trump was going to do any of this. So I don't think the RNC or any Republican state party is out there trying to mess with Donald Trump in any way.
Yeah, I mean, no one would be paying attention to this political system without Trump in the race. And so when he says, oh, the system is rigged, well, it's been that way for a while, and I think we can acknowledge that. But no one, especially millennials, paid attention to this. There will be a lot of people that vote tomorrow in the New York primary that never voted in a primary. Myself included, it's my first time voting in a presidential election. But there are people that are, baby boomers who are voting in the primary for the first time, whether it be for Trump or whoever, because the situation, the delegates is coming up and they're learning about it. This has all been a learning experience. I mean, you can check the ratings for the cable news networks. They're all all-time highs. The debates have reached all-time highs because people are paying attention to it, whether it be because Trump and Sanders, and there's a lot of anger, in the country for sure. But as far as the delegates are concerned, I think it will come down to California. I just got back from California 2 days ago, and I want to talk to people about Donald Trump and the GOP and what they sense. And a lot of people are closet Trump supporters, what I call them. They're afraid to say that they like Trump until they realize that, maybe you lean a little conservative or maybe it's a little safe to tell you, but they don't want to say it. They rather make jokes about Donald Trump rather than support him. Others, maybe Kasich supporters, they feel a little bit more safe. Ted Cruz supporters don't want to come out and say they support Ted Cruz, but there are a large numbers of supporters. California, we know, is a liberal state. It will come down to those small counties as well. But I think it's going to a contested convention, and the GOP screws themselves if they set someone up there, if they put a puppet up to stage and say, listen, we're going to take the delegates and we're going to give it to, let's have Paul Ryan be the nominee. And obviously he said, I don't want it. But who knows what they do. If they play any tricks, play any games, they're giving it to Hillary Clinton.
Well, Paul Ryan said that about the House speakership, too, so.
That's very true. But he said he's not going to, he made a press conference, said I'm not going to run if he does eventually get the nomination. People are going to say, hey, wait a minute, what's the GOP doing? Is the establishment, and then Trump's likely going to sue? Does he run third party? Who knows?
Yeah, I don't think the RNC or the Republican Party is trying to put Paul Ryan in. I don't know where this whole idea came from, but Paul Ryan knows himself that if he just suddenly jumped in, he would essentially just get rid of democracy almost. I mean, it's just undemocratic to have someone who never campaigned, who never announced to run for president, suddenly take up the nomination. I mean, it's just ridiculous. I don't think Paul Ryan's trying to do that, even though he said, I don't want to be speaker. I think that was a little bit different than taking the nominee.
Right. And, John Kasich, sorry to interrupt you. I mean, John Kasich, he doesn't have a path to the presidency or the vice presidency either. I mean, the way the rules are written, and this is another thing, I mean, the way the rules are written, you had to win, 8 states to be considered for the presidency or vice presidency in the primaries, 8 primary states. He has won 1 state. Marco Rubio has more delegates than he has. So if he all of a sudden becomes the nominee because they rewrite the rules on day one, where's that coming from? He can't even be vice president. So it's really between Trump and Cruz, but they could rewrite the rules on day one, and this is what people say, it's the establishment, it's the elites. And even though Donald Trump makes billions of dollars, he's not considered elite. He's not the establishment.
And I think this is like some really interesting things that folks are bringing up right now, because when you ask young people about who do they identify with in terms of political parties, they're usually not. We see many more young people who are identifying as independents instead of as Democrats or Republicans. What they think on the issues, might push them more one way versus another. But this is, I think, we're at this really key moment right now as it relates to the youth vote, as a lot of young people are really excited to turn out. After March 15th, we've now started to see record-breaking numbers from young Democrats and young Republicans. We've seen record-breaking turnout from young Republicans since the very beginning, since Iowa, basically. And a lot of this, especially now, is getting to this frustration that I think a lot of people are feeling of, all right, we have people who are running who are very anti-establishment, anti-party, but are having to run in this narrow party system with a generation who's pretty anti-party to begin with, but yet is still wanting to be engaged and feeling blocked out as there's all these rules that people have to navigate through. It just doesn't feel very democratic. It doesn't feel like this country that we were raised to believe, it should be. And so, kudos to these young people for knowing the rules and going in and out of spending a lot of time clearly to get to know it. But for a lot of folks, that is a big lift when, you're trying to raise family or you're, trying to work and in school and do 10 different things at once. And so, again, kudos to y'all for doing that, but this is why at Rock the Vote we're like, okay, how do we make this easier? How do we make it so we can have same-day registration so people can show up if need be? We have automatic voter registration. So then it's just easier to engage and for people to really show who they want to be president of the United States.
In Connecticut, voter registration has skyrocketed in the last, or I think there are people who are changing their party affiliation because they want to vote for a particular candidate, and they still have some time. I think they still have another week in Connecticut because they also have a closed primary like New York, where you have to be registered with a party to vote in the primary. But in Connecticut, they have some more time. So that shows how interested people become late in the game, maybe even a few days or maybe the day of.
Absolutely.
And in New York, it's too late.
Absolutely. I mean, especially for a lot of first-time voters, a lot of new voters, whether they're younger or whether they're older, it's intimidating, even for those of us who've been voting for a few elections, to figure out, all right, who stands on what, and where should I really? I mean, we were spending time in New Hampshire with some young voters, and this young woman casted her vote, and we were talking to her afterwards, and then she was like, "Oh my goodness, I think I made the wrong decision." And it's like, wait a minute, no, you made the great decision for yourself in this moment, but there's a lot of pressure that we put on people to make the perfect decision. And, sometimes that means that people put off registering, which is why, again, issues are making sure we have things like same-day registration are so important so people could just participate. I mean, we saw that in Wisconsin and how important that was in Wisconsin to make sure that people were able to cast their ballot. Same-day registration made it so young people could really have these epic turnout numbers that they did, again, on both sides of the aisle.
But these decisions are up to the states. The federal government can't do anything about it. Each state has their own rules.
Each state has their own rules. And so this is why, as much as we're absolutely all about the presidential election, we're like, all right, let's look further down the ballot as well and make sure we're looking at other races that are happening either within party leadership for people to get engaged in parties, because that's what we have, or if it's looking at state-led races, for example, or county commissioners or Secretary of State races even.
Right. All right, let's turn back to our panel, and a lot has been said about, Trump wanting to build the wall, about his ideas on improving, America's status in the manufacturing sector, and his views on how do you deal with ISIS. And they've been delivered in such a way that sort of becomes the story. That isn't this crazy, isn't this outlandish? These are issues of importance to millennials. So do you think that personalities in this campaign and the way things have been said and the way things come out really cloud where the candidates stand on the issues? And do young Republicans really know where the candidates stand on the issues when they go to the polls on Tuesday?
Yeah, I'd say no. I think young people don't pay attention to the race as much as we do. Just by talking to Maddie and Johannes before, I could tell. I mean, we follow it every single day. We live and breathe it. And for someone like me who's covering it and been in New Hampshire and see that those people, especially in New Hampshire, they want to make sure that they make the right decision because they feel like their vote matters so much. In New York, I'm not sure that the vote matters as much because they know it's a liberal state, and come the general election, it's not going to come down to New York. It's come down to New Hampshire. It's going to come down to Iowa, Ohio, Florida. New York, I feel like a lot of New Yorkers, and being a born and raised in New York, a lot of people aren't that concerned about it. But I think people don't really pay attention to it as much. And as far as the rhetoric, things get lost in the rhetoric every day. Hillary Clinton, her laugh bugs people, and that draws a lot of attention. Her getting through the turnstile. Bernie Sanders complaining about the bankers, and people like to do imitations. And Donald Trump, whatever he says, they're broadcasting his speech live, and people like to say, well, he's getting more media attention. He's smart. He knows that it's more valuable to go on, make himself accessible, go on live, on Fox News and CNN, on all the stations, and local radio as well. And he knows that that's better than just sending out TV ads. Didn't work for Marco Rubio, especially in his home state of Florida. And Trump was there. And I think the ground game is important as well, but it's the narrative. I know someone at Hofstra, I go to Hofstra University as well with Johannes, and I'm sitting in political science class, and we had John Kasich was there for a town hall a couple of weeks ago. And his decision, he actually changed his mind and said, I'm going to support John Kasich now because he saw Kasich. My teacher was like, well, what made you change his mind? Well, I thought he was a nice guy, whatever. Yeah, he's a nice guy. And I understand if you could talk about the issues, but it was just because you saw him in person and maybe shook his hand. That's not how we should be voting. We should be voting, you should be changing back and forth. You should be voting based on the issues. The wall, for example, I mean, they started the construction in 2006 with 670 miles of construction, cost us $2.4 billion. It stopped in 2009 when President Barack Obama took office. So if we continue that path, and there was a video last month that showed someone smuggling drugs jumping over the border, well, we need to secure that border just because we need national security. People, refugees that are coming in, they're infiltrating the population. I said they're going to do that. They've done it in Europe. So if you're going to secure the wall, and everyone on the GOP side supports that, what's the plan? And that's what we need to know is what's the plan? And if Mexico is going to pay for it, as Trump says, well, what is the deficit? Because we don't even know that number. I looked at government records. We spend $233 million on average to Mexico for things like border control and also security, and also clean, to keep the area clean. So if we're spending $233 million a year, what's the deficit? Can they pay for it? Who knows? But let's talk about that.
I want to ask you guys, what the Republican candidates are saying that's speaking to you guys as New Yorkers. We know we've seen them in the last few days campaigning a lot in upstate New York, where there's much more of, frustration with the status quo, where these used to be a lot of manufacturing communities. New York obviously has a very diverse economy. And what are the issues that are speaking to you, not just as millennials, but as New Yorkers, as people from this region that resonate with you from the Republican candidates?
So I think for both, I mean, for millennials and just for New Yorkers in general, I think it's job creation and a better overall economy. I think the biggest thing as a millennial, you graduate college, you have all the student loan debt. The best way to pay for that student loan is to have a job, to have some sort of source of income. And I think with President Obama, and you look at Bernie Sanders or Hillary Clinton, I don't think they can do that. I don't think they're going to be able to bring in jobs. You look at the state of New York, the state of New York's economy isn't that great. You have young people living in Long Island who are moving out of Long Island because the economy and the job creation just isn't doing that well. That's why I think somebody like Donald Trump or John Kasich is a better fit for millennials, because they're going to help with the main problem that millennials are having, which is job creation and a better economic environment. I think the biggest thing is we need jobs, and we need jobs for young people, and Democrats aren't doing that. But I think Donald Trump, who wants to bring manufacturing back to America, and John Kasich, who wants to bring in a balanced budget, I think that stuff will help young people and New Yorkers in general.
Also, just to add off of that, I think that, as millennials, we were alive when 9/11 took place. We were, whether we were really young or, soon to be teenagers, that's of our time era as well. And so, and myself personally, my father was killed on September 11th. And so that is a dear topic of discussion for me. When I hear Trump's plan of increasing our national security, we see what's happened in Belgium and in France, and we're continuing to still have these issues, and it's not on our soil anymore, but now it's overseas with allies. And so when we hear Trump saying, he's going to do this with the refugees, and he's going to do that with the wall, and we want that plan. We want to hear what he has to say. And I think a lot of people, I disagree with you. I think millennials are tuning in to hear what he has to say about that. I have siblings that are millennials. I have obviously many friends, and they are interested in knowing that. And especially the New York ones, but also the ones that are abroad when these attacks take place, and the ones that continue to face the fear of, we won't have some of these social issues to talk about if we're not here to talk about them. So, yeah.
Right. I mean, 9/11, I was thinking about it yesterday, I was reflecting on that. I mean, I was 5 years old. I remember coming home that day from school and watching the planes go into the tower. And for me, I mean, that boils up anger inside of me. I mean, I'm a New Yorker and watched that, but I think everyone in the country, who's alive remembers that. And it's sad that we have people who are being born out don't know what 9/11 was. And that's something that, talk about this primary, talk about national security and what Trump is doing to rally New Yorkers behind him. There's no question why he's leading in the polls. Right. And Ted Cruz is third. Because when Ted Cruz made that comment about New York values during that debate, that really bothered a lot of New Yorkers, to say the least. And when Trump says, hey, we're all good people. We live in the city. We know people who were affected that day. My sister, her friend, had someone who was in her class was crying because she didn't know whether her father, as a firefighter, was down there. I know people who were affected. My dad worked there a couple of years before that. And it's very upsetting, and to know that we need to do something about these terrorists who want to kill us. Why are we going to let refugees come into this country? I mean, Obama has made an executive order to allow Syrian refugees into our country without any proper background checks. That, as someone who lives in this big city, we don't want someone to come in, infiltrate our population, and cause widespread damage like they did on 9/11. And there were attacks that were thwarted, many attacks. There was one, I was watching a documentary, a 60 Minutes documentary a couple months ago. They were able to prevent a similar attack that would have affected New York, California, a bunch of other states, all on one day. And, the CIA knew about it, and they were able to prevent that from happening. So we need to do more about national security. And, and as far as experience goes, John Kasich has experience, with economics as a governor. Trump, you look at him and you say, well, maybe he doesn't have experience, but maybe he knows good people.
Those,
and that's the thing.
those with experience have yet to do anything. I mean,
I agree with you.
I think we need to see an end of these career politicians who spend most of their time worrying about when they're going to be reelected, and they had opportunity to make these changes. And now we see Trump coming in, and he's changed the face of an election. He's changed the face of how many people are interacting with the election. He's changed the face of media, what's being picked up by media, what liberal media is twisting. He's, really calling out all of these shots that a lot of these career politicians don't do because they're worried about risking kind of their image and their brand, and they want to be reelected. And you don't see kind of these headstrong people who say, enough of that.
Yeah,
That's not how our system was built. Our system was supposed to be built that you're in office for 4 to 8 years, and that's that. And then after that, it's time for the next person to come in and change and help and build and make America continue to stay as great as it is. And that hasn't been happening for a while.
Well, let me just quickly say,
Yeah.
I think one thing that you're noticing right here is that a lot of the anger that we have here with the Republican Party, you always hear the media saying the Republican Party is just angry, they're filled with hate. It's because of the 8 years of Barack Obama, especially when you talk about the national security,
Right.
is the fact that he wants to use his political correctness and doesn't want to, really destroy ISIS. He just wants to keep it there and not cause any trouble or whatever. I think that's what upsets us as Republican millennials, and I think as all Republicans. And so when you see Donald Trump coming in here and he just says, let's just get rid of them, let's just, cut to the chase and just get to it, I think that's what Republicans are looking for. I
It's
think,
authentic.
Well, it's authentic, but it's also the fact that he's tired of playing these games. President Obama and Democrats, they're all playing these games, and to some Republicans, they're playing these games of, we don't really want to
it's
get
both
to
sides.
the work. It's almost
Yeah,
a little
right.
bit of laziness, and so Donald Trump wants to get to that. I think the thing, though, is that Donald Trump, what concerns me is he doesn't know any good people in national security. He released some of his national security advisors, and they're people no one's ever heard of. One of them is 25 years old who just recently got his PhD. I mean,
Well, he should release who's
he-
advising him. He should.
And the thing is that if you want to get in people, good people, they're experts who are with the establishment Republicans, but Donald Trump, to a degree, has burned those bridges. And that's a problem I have with Donald Trump. Respectively, I like how he's blunt. I like that he's authentic, but he's gone a little bit too aggressive, I think, and in burning bridges with the Republican establishment because he needs them, especially with national
He needs to
security.
be able to work with Congress, which is something President Obama hasn't done.
But
I
I think
agree.
as
I
a
agree with you.
businessman, though, he's worked with Democrats. He's helped Hillary. He's worked with women.
He knows the other end of it
Right.
in
He
the
knows.
private
He
sector.
worked with women. He manages a business, many businesses. So when people say that he's too aggressive and he's going to burn bridges and maybe start wars with other countries, I think he's built too much to have that kind of recklessness. I think that he can work with
Part of
others.
it's part of his
He wouldn't be
negotiating
as
skills.
successful as he is if he couldn't work with others.
I'm not
Right.
saying he can't work with those, but just look at how he's behaving in the media. The thing is, when you're dealing with, Donald Trump isn't a politician, but you have career politicians in Congress. These
Right.
types of people have to react towards what he does in the public media. And so if he's out there treating everyone like garbage and he's fighting the Republican establishment is going to have a hard time working with him in Congress. That's a fear that I have. And you have people, he criticized everyone in the Bush administration. Those are the people with the experience in foreign policy from the Republican side. You criticize their views,
Right.
they're not going to want to work with you. And then all he has in his national security advisor is a 25-year-old guy with a PhD.
I get that, but at this point, I think he knows to an extent what he's doing. He's making it basically business. I mean, look what he's done. He has labeled.
tailoring it.
He's
He's
tailoring
pulling
it
it
well.
together.
He's a master brander, is what he is. I mean, he called Ted Cruz Lion Ted. Everyone's calling him
don't
Lion
disagree with
Ted.
that. No,
Little Marco,
yeah.
and then what was it? Hillary Clinton came out. I heard this morning and called Hillary. What was it? Corrupt Hillary or something.
I guess. I mean, that makes
so
sense.
or whatever it was. But he's already branding Hillary for the general election if he gets to that point. But I think as far as on the other side, Hillary Clinton saying we need a path to citizenship. Well, no question she wants a path to citizenship because she wants them to rush in and vote for her. President Obama tried to change the electorate in his reelection. And when he was going for re-election in 2012, he said, well, let me bring in more refugees and let me change the electorate so that they'll vote for me. And that's essentially what he did. And he got young voters to vote for him. The young voters don't want to vote for Hillary, but she'll get, if she's in the general election, she'll get immigrants coming in. And what also from the millennials, I hear all the time from people who have, ancestors who are came into America, whether it was legally or illegally. Well, mostly illegally, though. They say, well, I'm going to be deported. you're from the Bronx. You're not, you're not being deported, and if you did things the right way, then at least you can be proud of that. I know legal immigrants who are very upset, that like Trump, they're very upset that, these illegal immigrants are coming in, they're getting benefits. And the legal immigrants came in, they did things the right way. They came in through Ellis Island and,
Right.
and they want to
So-
be respected for that.
Going
Now,
based
the,
off of
the issues that you guys are so passionate about are national security and the economy, jobs. These are the issues that
Absolutely.
the Republican candidates are speaking to you guys as millennials and as New Yorkers. What are some of the? Do you guys have trouble with some of the social issues? As for the Marla mentioned that most millennial voters, millennial Republicans, are much more liberal on social issues. Do you find yourselves sort of leaning that way? And if so, do you feel like there are other millennials who feel the way you do and are still undecided this close to the primary?
I think absolutely. I'm not going to speak for you guys, but I think many of us feel that socially, like you said earlier, we have friends that are either gay or lesbian. We have many of the social issues affect most of us near and dear, and it is an emotional aspect of the elections. And unfortunately, though, I don't think you base an election and who you vote for based on the social views. And like you said, we do have such bigger issues at hand that I don't think it should be in the hands of the president to decide whether gay marriage takes place. And I think it should be up to the people. And I think that should be on a smaller scale of
The next
issues.
president will appoint a Supreme Court justice. So that is a
right.
concern.
It is, and I understand that, but I don't think that in the big picture of what, as Americans, that we're facing right now, that those are the core.
I just want to say, with the Supreme Court justice thing, I think what a lot of people forget right now is the person that passed away was Scalia, who was a
very
strong
conservative.
conservative. So
Right.
even if you had a Republican president who puts in a strong conservative, that
Right.
doesn't really change the balance of the Supreme Court. You have
As it was before.
as it was
And
before.
Trump is a little more on that side of, liberal, more of a socially liberal person, I think. So, I mean, we don't know.
Yeah, he's actually the most moderate
Right,
on the
right,
stage.
exactly.
More than Cruz, certainly.
Right.
Yeah, well, Cruz is far right. I mean, Cruz and Bernie Sanders are the opposite sides of the spectrum. But as far as gay marriage is concerned, I mean, I have close friends who are homosexual, and that doesn't. I mean, that's how they live their lives. That's shouldn't be what we design an election on. And the social issues really aren't a concern. National security, economics are the concern. Getting jobs, people coming out that are graduating college come out with tons of debt, and they're not getting the jobs that you were coming out of college, that people that baby boomers had. President Barack Obama, certainly under him, the unemployment rate has dropped. You can't deny that. But the jobs that he's creating are lower paid jobs. We need to create jobs that are, first of all, in this country. And I think all the GOP candidates, especially Trump, really points to patriotism and gets
Right.
people excited about America.
More to aspire for.
Exactly, he inspires people. But let's focus on jobs in this country that are higher paid. We got to look at the technology sector. Why does Apple have most of their employees, in China? Let's bring them to America. Let's do that.
And,
But you
I think they're also raising some really interesting pieces here when we look at social issues versus what is seen as more traditional economic issues. With the millennial generation, we're the largest generation, we're the most diverse generation our country has ever seen. And whether or not people decide to vote on social issues, I think a thing that we forget about is that there's also a component of people being our neighbors, right? And the people we went to school with. So whether they're lesbian or gay or bisexual or transgender, there's marriage as a piece, but there's also the ability for people to be fired or kicked out of their housing for who they are. When we talk about immigration, which often gets put in a social issues category, there's also a deeply an economic component. And then also, again, the who's my neighbor, right? 15% of millennials were not born in the United States. That doesn't mean they're undocumented. They could be legal permanent residents. They could be refugees, right? We have our generation has this 15% number other generations haven't seen in the U.S. for 100 years. So we're also an immigrant generation. And so when you put all these pieces together, absolutely the number one issue for young people, regardless of their political party, is the economy, which has to do with stagnant wages and what is the minimum wage and it's student debt for sure. But I think there's also this other piece that we're seeing with millennials and young people crossing party lines, quote unquote, on some issues where the majority of even young Republicans want a pathway to citizenship or pathway to legal status based on a poll that we've done previously. So a lot of these social issues have an economic component to them. And I think a lot of young people are seeing that and trying to like weave in and out and figure out, all right, I might feel like this, maybe I'm more economically conservative, but when I dig down into some of these issues, maybe I'm moving this way a little bit. And this for us is this opportunity for candidates to get way more nuanced, because young people are also, as intimidating as voting can be, they're really sophisticated voters. They are using social media to try to look up information about candidates and what they think and what they believe, and to hold up a higher standard to say, okay, you want this, how are you going to do it? Tell me how is that going to happen, that you're going to deal with my student debt that I'm drowning in, that I'm going to get better paid wages than what I'm currently getting, or a job to begin with, because I just graduated and I'm extra struggling right now.
And Sarah, at least we know where the GOP candidates stand. I mean, and we know where Bernie Sanders stands. Where does Hillary Clinton stand? Because I hear her this morning on WCBS, and she's saying that she's more moderate, and and Bernie Sanders is talking nonsense. But she goes into another liberal state, and all of a sudden she's so far left, and she agrees with President Barack Obama. Where does she stand in this? She doesn't even agree with her husband. So pick a side and pick a stance and stay there. I have no idea where she stands.
Do you feel like there are a lot of undecided voters in your generation? Obviously, they may not be able to decide until the general election,
Right,
when the candidates are already chosen before the primary if they haven't registered with the party. But are you hearing from a lot of people who just aren't sure at this point?
I don't think they're undecided. I think most millennials are just anti-institution. So like when you see this rise of independence, it's not really because people are not conservative or not liberal. It's just that they don't like having the labels and being bound to a specific political party. But I think most millennials in this way is a little bit similar to the previous generations, which is that you do have this idea where people do lean to the left or lean to the right. I think the independents or the undecided is still at a minority of 10, maybe 15%, I think. But most millennials, I have a feeling, know where sort of they want to go on.
Yeah, I think everyone made up their mind at this point. I think there are a lot of young people who like Bernie Sanders. I know a lot who don't want to hear you and it goes back to political correctness thing. When I do a morning talk show at Hofstra's radio station, and I turn on the mic, and I'm going to be honest. I always give facts and and we'll give figures and all that. But I'm going to speak from the heart. I'm going to be honest about things. And God forbid you're not a little not politically correct down the line. People question you. At least my peers will say, well, how could you say something like that? But they're just that's just spin on their end. So you have to be honest, but you have to also be real. And I think there are a lot of people who, oh my God, they said something. I mean, you have to be realistic. You have to be authentic. And I think that's lost in our generation. I think a lot of people are very concerned with how they act and can't be honest about how they feel. And if you do, you're going to be criticized for it, whether it be in social media or right in front of your face.
Well, and that's, I think, why Trump is really taking everybody by storm, because he's basically saying exactly what you're saying is, the day of political correctness has gotten to the point where nobody can get anything done. Nobody can have a say in anything that won't offend. So I agree. And I think that Trump is the one who's taking the lid off that cap and just running with it.
And I think with the millennials, at least, is that a lot of it, when it comes to this political correctness, we get that from the universities that we go to. Most college campuses are extremely liberal, and I think every single person that's vehemently, we have to be politically correct, we have to, make sure recognize these people, or we have to make sure, don't say that word or whatever. A lot of it comes from these liberal professors that essentially just brainwash and propagandize.
Makes you uncomfortable, right?
Yeah, and it makes you uncomfortable, and then they have it. But I think after they graduate college, after 5-10 years,
you find your voice again.
You find your voice again, and you forget about that type of stuff, and you kind of focus on more realistic things. You
that's
focus
why people
about
care
the
about
economy,
economics.
and that's why I'm waiting for this in 5-10 years. You're going to see millennials suddenly start to switch, become less liberal, become more conservative, because right now we're getting brainwashed on college campuses.
It's high school too.
I think that shift happens in every generation. It's just age.
Absolutely.
Yeah, but I think also, in the polling that we've done with USA Today, we go 18 to 35-year-olds. So we take a much more expansive look at the age of the millennial generation. And for folks that are in the 29 to 35-year-old age group, there is a little bit of a dip in terms of those going from left to a bit more right. But it's maybe 5% of a drop on issues where young people are like, 70% of us identify as XYZ. So I think that's another thing for us to keep in mind, that I think there is a larger generational piece here. Certainly people get a bit more conservative, or at least generationally, it happens with everyone. They get a little more conservative, but I think how much more so is a big question. And I think as we're talking about some of these issues, whether it's the economy or whether it is social issues or whatever, it's issue by issue, right? Getting to young people not liking generalizations, not liking political parties. They want to go deeper. They don't just want to say, I'm conservative economically. Well, what does that mean? Right. What do you think about student debt and the minimum wage and paid leave and all of these other issues that the generation is really trying to work through? Because
some
we were hit
can't
hardest.
verbalize that.
Well, yeah, and we were just, I mean, young people were hit hardest by the recession. And whether, and they're still trying to crawl out of it. Whether you are in college right now, whether you are 29 years old and have a kid and are going back to school or going to school for the first time, or maybe you're 35 and you have, you're married and have a couple kids and they're older, right? Their generation is so diverse. And I think that's what's so interesting because we're so large, really diverse. We have a lot of things that we're going through right now. And this is where it's all about the candidates to just like step up and really reach out to speak to these challenges that we're facing, whether it's student debt, stagnant wages, or national security for sure.
Sarah, we're going to let you have the last word there, and thank you so much for joining us today, and thank you to our panelists, Neil, Johannes, and Maddie. Thank you for watching this special presentation of Make It Count, the Republicans and the New York primary.
With Marla Diamond, I'm Sonia Rincon, and you can also find our event with the Democratic supporters on CBSNewYork.com. Thanks for joining us.